This is Lab 11, the spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, and reflexes. So as usual, we're going to match up our functions to these particular structures, and then we'll see these structures in parts of the spinal cord, the layers of the meninges, on a couple models, and then we'll move on to cranial nerve functions, and then some reflex. Okay, so let's go ahead and match up our functions. A, myelinated axons that carry sensor information to the brain. So we're talking about things within the spinal cord itself. That would be the ascending tracts. So A with ascending tracts. B, myelinated axons that carry motor impulses away from the brain. Those would be the descending tracts. Ascending and descending tracts are part of the white matter of the spinal cord. C contains sensory neuron cell bodies. That would be the dorsal or posterior root ganglion. Then D, area containing adipose that cushions as or acts as a cushion for the spinal cord. That is way up at the top, epidural space. E, the most innermost protective layer of the spinal cord. That would be the pia mater. F, the middle protective layer around the spinal cord, is the arachnoid mater. G, the outermost protective layer of the spinal cord, that would be the dura mater. So there, where we're here, the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia maters, those are the three connective tissue layers that constitute what's called the meninges, right, to protect the brain and spinal cord. Between the arachnoid mater and pia mater, I sandwiched it in between, is the subarachnoid space. So I kind of put it in order from outer to inner. We have an epidural space that's going to be fat. Then we'll see a dura mater, arachnoid mater, a subarachnoid space, and pia mater when we look at the different meninges and spaces above and around the meninges. And then we get into here, the central canal, and all these are either tracts of fibers into or out of the spinal cord or within the white matter itself, like here, ascending and descending tracts, the white matter versus the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay, then we're going to move on to H, the space within the protective layers filled with cerebral spinal fluid. That would be the subarachnoid space. I contains association neuron cell bodies, or interneuron cell bodies, sometimes referred to. That would be the dorsal or posterior horn, which means it's part of the gray matter. J contains motor neuron cell bodies. That would be the anterior or ventral root. The anterior or ventral horn. K contains motor axons exiting the spinal cord. That would be your anterior or ventral roots. L contains sensory axons entering the spinal cord. So they're going to enter posteriorly. That would be the dorsal or posterior root. M transports nutrients and gases to nerve tissue and cushions the spinal cord. That's actually the function of the one at the bottom, the cerebrospinal fluid. And then N, the interior tube in the spinal cord filled also with CSF. That would be the central canal. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next exercise. We're going to, the peripheral nerve anatomy slide. We're going to look at a cross-section of a bundle of nerves. We looked at muscle and we looked at on the model, we said, well, the outer connective tissue around this entire muscle, represents the epimysium. I'm about to say epinurium. So the epimysium, epi meaning above and around, is around the entire muscle. Then you had the paramysium around the fascicle, the endomysium around one fiber or one cell. Well, we organize the same way in nerves. We have the connective tissue that surrounds the entire nerve. Oops, excuse me, my book was slid. Entire nerve, that's the epinurium. All right, so don't confuse epimysiums with epinuriums. Right. The connective tissue around one fascicle of nerves is the perineurium. and around one nerve axon or fiber. That's going to be our endoneurium. So similar to the muscle, it's just, around the entire nerve, then one fascicle or one particular cell, epiperiendoneuriums. We're going to look at the axon and the myelin sheath when we can. And I'll show you what it looks like on the slide. It's identify, identify, identify. Okay, this is the hairier part. So now we're going back to the cranial nerves. The last quiz included being able to identify cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You should now have and really be working on memorizing, cranial nerve 1 is olfactory, optic, oculomotor. You should be able to identify, know that oculomotor is the third cranial nerve, but what the Roman numeral 3, how you might write that. Not that I'm generally going to ask you, but all your images and all the brain models and going forward, even into your nursing classes and physical therapy classes, they're going to be using the cranial nerves as well. Okay, so now that we know where they are in the brain models and we know what their names are, now we're going to put some sensory and motor functions to them. And then in the last column here, I put the model or slide. And so what I try to do is make a list here of what particular slides we might be using either this week or even next week, because when we have one more lab, special senses. So sometimes we have to actually wait till we see our special senses to know exactly which muscle, let's say, the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4 innervates. Right now, we're going to say it's an eye muscle, and we're going to look at the eye model, but next week, we'll then kind of connect that back again. So sometimes it's just going to be, even though we don't do it till next week, when it comes to the ability to smell, the like functions of olfactory nerve maybe, or taste, like taste is conveyed on 3 different cranial nerves, depending on where in the mouth. We generally use the taste bud slide. So over here, I kind of make note of, sometimes what the model is, what the model or the slide is that's going to be representative of maybe sensory or motor functions, for these different cranial nerves. And that's the part that gets a little bit hairy. So you kind of have to work on what you can for this quiz, the basics of it. And then by next week, when we get into more of the special senses, because a lot of the special senses are conveyed on cranial nerves, then it will come together a little bit more. Okay, so we had the cranial nerve in one column, sensory functions, if there are any, motor functions, if there are any. Sometimes we have both, like trigeminal nerve and facial nerve, glossopharyngeal and vagus. They have both sensory and motor functions. So in saying that, I would expect to maybe have multiple models be representative of maybe sensory versus motor functions. But we can kind of fill this out right now as we go, and you kind of get an idea of this. Okay, so let's start with cranial nerve 1, olfactory. The sense is smell, right? And it has no motor function. And I'll just tell you, the first 2 cranial nerves are sensory only, and then the last 2 on the bottom are really motor only. It says minimal sensory, and that's correct. There's a certain amount of what's called proprioceptive sensation that comes from it, but you can't isolate it and test it. So for things like where we have minimal sensory here, don't worry about that. I'm not going to ask you about it. I'm just going to tell you. If your lecture teacher says, well, that's considered that portion of the sensory for oculomotor is called proprioception, then you can write proprioception, wherever you see minimal sensory. And that will make it really consistent with your lecture class, but I don't ask about it because it's not testable. Okay, so back to cranial nerve 1. The sensation is smell. And the model or slide I would use is actually just pointing to the nose on that, on either, generally it's going to be one of the torso models. There's a little, what I call the baby on the plate models, where you can point to his little nose. Is what's called a naked body on a plate. It's actually supposed to be like an infant, and you can see the skin. So we're going to use skin of the face and skin of the torso for that. But also I could just point to his nose, and that would be representative of the ability to smell, or olfactory nerve. Okay, optic nerve is vision, and the slide would be an eye model by pointing right to, on the cornea where you can see into the pupil. And if I ask you what cranial nerve is associated with this, now we're talking about this is a visual pathway, and so that would be optic. Okay, when we get to oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, 3, 4, and 6, we can kind of group them together right now. Trigeminal nerve, I'm going to come back to that. So oculomotor is eye movement, trochlear is eye movement, and abducens is eye movement. Okay, the model is going to be one of the eye model. Now, if you like, we can write down the specific muscles associated with these cranial nerves. And let me just back up. You have 6 muscles that attach to your eyeball. They're called the extrinsic muscles of the eye. And most of them, 4 of them, are going to be innervated by oculomotor cranial nerve 3. But one muscle is uniquely innervated by the trochlear nerve here, number 4, and one of them by abducens only. Right? So trochlear and abducens, they only innervate one muscle. And we can write that down now if you like. Everything else will be oculomotor. And maybe here, just, I wouldn't take the time to write all 4 out individually. But for trochlear nerve, I'm going to identify exactly which one it is. All right, so for oculomotor, 3, 4, and 6, trigeminal and abducens. All right, when it comes to motor function, we can put eye movement, eye movement, eye movement for each one. And the model is going to be, the eye in the orbit, or an eye model somehow. Let me tell you now, the specific muscle that you can put here by the eye model for trochlear, so on the same, over here on the trochlear column, you can put superior oblique, because that is the only muscle that trochlear identifies. And for abducens, you can write in lateral rectus. Here in oculomotor, right now, you can just put all else or all other muscles, something like that. Because that's how I'm going to, refer to it next lab. Out of all 6 of those muscles, we have trochlear that innervates, or is the nerve supply to the superior oblique muscles, but you haven't seen it yet on a model, but you can write it down now. Abducens is for your lateral rectus muscle. It's going to be the lateral mid area of the eyeball. And then the other 4 remaining muscles, which is kind of a pain to write down now, those are all innervated by oculomotor. Oculomotor innervates the most structures. It innervates, a region of the pupil for pupillary constriction, what's called levator palpebrae, that elevates the eyelid, so it innervates a bunch of different things. But trochlear is just superior oblique, and abducens is just lateral rectus. And then next week, when we look at the models more, then we'll connect it back again. Okay, if I haven't belabored that point, I'm sorry, but anyway. Okay, now let's go back to trigeminal, because trigeminal has nothing to do with eye movement, right? It has sensory function. The sensory function is facial sensation. It's the skin of the face, so very superficial. And then the motor function are the muscles of mastication, or your chewing muscles. They're generally called mastication muscles. And an example of that would be, on the muscle models, temporalis and the masseter muscles. Temporalis and masseter muscles. Okay, we did abducens. Let's move on to facial, another mixed nerve like this. It conveys taste, from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, so close to your teeth, your incisors and things, into the front of your teeth. That this facial nerve carries the taste sensation from that region. The motor functions are your muscles of facial expression. So muscles of facial expression could be something like zygomaticus. Zygomaticus attaches to the corners of the mouth, and when it contracts, it lifts the corners of the mouth, so you're smiling. Okay, then we'll move on to vestibulocochlear nerve. This is technically really 2 completely different sensations, but they all come from the inner ear. And again, this will be something that we'll connect back when we look at the ear model in the next and last lab. So this is sensation for hearing and equilibrium. And the model or slide is going to be a model. This is going to be the ear model. Okay, then we go on to glossopharyngeal. Now, glossopharyngeal get a little complicated because they cover a lot of territory. Glosso means tongue and pharyngeal means the throat area. And then vagus is vagus. Right? So, these two nerves cover a lot of territory, either, overlapping somewhat in the throat area, and then below the shoulders, is going in the thoracic or abdominal pelvic cavities is all going to be vagus. Right. So there's multiple complicated sensory functions, and I try to give you the ones that are most important. You can look some of these other ones up on your own, but I try to tie it together with the reflexes that you're going to be learning when you do a head and neck assessment in nursing, so that it's nothing new when you get into either the nursing or even the PTA program. Okay, so some of the glossopharyngeal sensory functions include taste. Taste is actually the area of the tongue that will be served by glossopharyngeal is the posterior third of the tongue, which is going to be the back of the tongue, toward your throat. Right? So it conveys taste. It conveys sensation from the back of the throat. So that kind of like the skin of the back of your throat, level with your tongue. It's called the oropharynx, Oropharynx, if you really want to know. And then its other major sensory function, it conveys blood pressure and blood gas levels. So sensation about blood pressure and blood gas levels from your carotid arteries in the neck area, where you take a carotid pulse. But you can just leave it as blood pressure and blood gas levels. What are the different models and slides? That would be the taste bud slide. It could also, I could be pointing to maybe arteries or veins on a model, like especially in the neck or chest area, but it would really be the neck area because that's where glossopharyngeal conveys the sensory information from the carotid arteries in the neck area. Glossopharyngeal, also its motor component is speech and swallowing to a certain degree. So maybe the tongue model, we have what's called the alien tongue model. It looks like just a tongue with a pharynx, a throat below it, and the bottom row of teeth in the mandible. So I'll show you what that looks like in a subsequent picture. I'm going to back up a little bit because I might have gotten ahead of myself when it came to the facial nerve. I don't think, in case I did or did not, I'm going to remind again of what the model or slide would be for facial nerve, because maybe I went a little too fast for that. For taste, that would be a taste bud slide. And the facial expression, that would be pointing to a muscle model and maybe pointing to that zygomaticus muscle. So in case I didn't mention it before, taste is going to be conveyed on three nerves: facial, this glossopharyngeal, and vagus. And so taste bud slide, taste bud slide, taste bud slide, for all three of those will be representative of the of taste. And I'll explain in a minute, well, when we get to the special senses, how I might do that. Or actually, I'll just tell you now. Right? Let's say after next week, we're going to look at taste buds. And I think I put up there a little index card that said, hey, these are the kinds of questions I could ask you looking at just the taste bud slide alone, because there's a variety of questions once we kind of pull it all together, and I could ask you, maybe identify one cranial nerve that conveys this special sense. Well, if we're looking at a taste bud slide, we're talking about taste, right? Or gustation. And it can be conveyed on either facial nerve, glossopharyngeal, or vagus. So, depending on the question, I might say which cranial nerves, in which case you'd be looking for an option that had listed all three cranial nerves. Or it could say, identify one nerve that conveys taste. And I might have just glossopharyngeal, and then I might have optic and trochlear and ocular motor or something like that. Then you pick the one that is capable of conveying taste. Okay, so let's move on to vagus because it too conveys taste, but this is from, farther down in the throat from the epiglottis. Remember, we talked about the epiglottis because that was a elastic cartilage location. All right, so it conveys taste. It also conveys sensory information regarding blood pressure and blood gas levels, but from what's called the aorta, the aortic arch, or the aorta, which is deep in the chest in the thoracic cavity. It also conveys visceral sensation. So what does that mean? It means that it conveys sensation, information about sensation from your, the organs in your abdominal pelvic cavity, as well as from that in your chest. Motor functions include the muscles to digestive organs and glands, all those organs that are in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. It's motor to the heart. It actually helps slow down the heart. It's very active in swallowing, especially in the lower, in the mid to lower throat areas. So what models, or slides, what might we use? Sorry. We could use the taste bud slide because this one conveys taste also. Just farther down, into your throat. I could maybe have that little, what's called the naked dude on a plate, and point to some of the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity or in the chest cavity, like the lungs, and that would, if I asked you what cranial nerves is associated with, these organs here, it would be vagus nerve, whether it's sensation or motor. If I was pointing to the heart specifically, it would be vagus nerve. So something to keep in mind here. Vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, is the only cranial nerve that either conveys sensory information or, sends motor neurons to organs below the shoulders in that anterior cavity, or that ventral cavity, the organs in your thoracic cavity or your abdominal pelvic cavity. It's the only nerve that serves anything really below the shoulders, not your legs, we're saying in the chest and in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Sensory to those organs and motor, to those organs. Now we can move on now to accessory and hypoglossal. Accessory nerve, it innervates, or its motor action is to move the head and shoulders. The specific muscles it innervates or is the nerve supply to the specific muscles of sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. So the motor function is to move the head and shoulders. The particular model is going to be a muscle model pointing to either trapezius or sternocleidomastoid. So when, it depends on whether the sternocleidomastoids on both sides of your neck contract, often if you want to turn your head to one side, let's say I want to turn my head to the right side, then my right sternocleidomastoid, is going to contract and rotate my head. Or actually, let me take that back. It doesn't really rotate. It's just going to twist your head, so to speak. So when the right sternocleidomastoid contracts, you bend your head to the right, but your chin actually kind of goes off to the left, so to speak. So you tilt your head kind of. It's not really rotating. And the left side, when it contracts by itself, you kind of flex a little bit forward. Your ear comes toward your shoulder, and your chin kind of spins off to your right shoulder a little bit. And so you kind of cock your head. I guess that's the best way to describe it. If they contract at the same time, then you kind of nod your head forward like you're saying yes. Trapezius acts on your head a little bit too, but mostly on your shoulders. to elevate your shoulders or depress them. So muscle model pointing to sternocleidomastoid or trapezius. So if you're, now we're combining, hey, last exam, we were just identifying those muscles, maybe an origin or an insertion or an action. Now we're going to look at those muscles like sternocleidomastoid and trapezius and say, hey, what cranial nerve is associated with that muscle? It would be accessory nerve. Up here for trigeminal, it might be pointing to temporalis or masseter because they help you chew, so they elevate the mandible. So I could be pointing to those muscles, say what cranial nerve is associated with them, and you'd say trigeminal. If I was maybe pointing to zygomaticus, I'd be asking about facial nerve because it's a muscle of facial expression. Okay, and then lastly, hypoglossal is highly associated with speech and swallowing. Again, I would use the alien tongue model. I'll show you what that looks like. So down here on the bottom, I gave you the sensory, some functions you could choose from and the motor functions. And here in red, I highlighted some specifically, like sensation to the throat. A lot of people don't ask that, but that's going to be glossopharyngeal, and I'll explain in just a minute. Blood pressure and gas levels is used by two different cranial nerves, glossopharyngeal and vagus. Eyeball movement, so you don't get confused. Yep. Oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. And I gave you kind of the specific muscles for trochlear and abducens. Swallowing is technically three nerves. We have glossopharyngeal, vagus, and hypoglossal. Oh, by the way, hypoglossal means below the tongue. So that's what they mean by it's mostly swallowing. Speech, there are two cranial nerves, hypoglossal and glossopharyngeal. So it's, you don't feel like you're going crazy when you go, oh my gosh, didn't I just use swallowing or speech or something? You did, because this is a lot of very finite muscular movement in very sensitive areas where you need to know specifically these different sensations. And so it's a bigger job for just sometimes one cranial nerve. And so we have multiple cranial nerves, contributing to that overall function. Okay, so now we're going to move on to spinal nerves and reflexes. We have two types of spinal reflex models, and we're going to identify the 5 components of a reflex arc and then look at their functions, so to speak. And we're going to see where they're located on these different models. One is one of those big cookie sheet models, and then one is actually another spinal cord without all the meninges around it. And you can see, starting at the skin where our sensory receptor is going to be, and then a sensory neuron to the gray matter and synapsing with a motor association neuron and motor neuron, and out you go to the effector. So we'll be able to see those in the models. Okay, so I put them in the proper order. You have 5 components of a reflex arc: are receptor, sensory neuron, association neuron, motor neuron, and effector. So you can do this either way. You can take the opportunity and write in each term next to each kind of definition, of the component of the reflex arc. Or maybe you can just, write 1 over receptor, 2 over sensory neuron, 3, 4, and 5 respectively, that these are the 5 components of the reflex arc, and then just write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 next to the particular statement. It's entirely up to you. All right, so let's start with carries impulse from the CNS to the effector. So go here and go, well, what connects to the effector? It would be the motor neuron. So the motor neuron carries impulses away from the cerebral, the central nervous system to the effector. All right, carries impulse from the receptor to the CNS. So go, okay, well, what's after receptor? That's sensory neuron. So sensory neuron would go in the second space. Carries impulse to the motor neuron. All right, so you go, okay, well, what connects to the motor neuron? Right, that would be the association or interneuron. The muscle or gland that responds to a stimulus, right? That is the effector. And responds to a stimulus and creates an action potential in a sensory neuron. That would be the receptor. That's where all this begins, is with some kind of receptor, something that detects a change in the environment. Okay, now that we're due to the last exercise here, it says compare and contrast the somatic reflex arc and autonomic reflex arc. Give one example of each. Okay, so we have effectors here, and then we have examples of reflexes. And we have the somatic nervous system versus the autonomic nervous system. All right, so somatic division is, all the sensory neurons, from everything other than any kind of special senses, really. So that's generally the motor component that goes to all the skeletal muscles. And the autonomic nervous system, innervates smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So that's really everything else. Okay, so then we have examples of reflexes here, and for somatic division and for the autonomic division. Below, we have the effectors. So I tell you, you either going to have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. That goes into the effectors. So we can fill that in right now. Skeletal muscle goes into the somatic division, and cardiac, smooth muscle, and glands go into the autonomic nervous system. Those are the ends. These are the organs that will respond to the motor neuron stimulus. It's the last component of your reflex arc. Okay, so our examples of reflexes. Well, we can kind of write them all in here, or we can maybe just write next to each of the list here, somatic versus autonomic, S versus A, as these reflex examples here. All right, so let's look at peristalsis. This is how we move food, when we try to propel food through the esophagus and through the rest of the digestive system. So that would be an example of an autonomic nervous system reflex. So you might just put A there for autonomic, and you could also just write in the box here, peristalsis. Flexor reflex or pain withdrawal, that is a somatic reflex. So you can just put S next to it, and then maybe up here in the somatic also write flexor reflex. Heart rate is an autonomic, as well as blood pressure regulation is also autonomic. So you could put A and A there right next to it. And then over here in autonomic, you can just go ahead and write it up there. Heart rate and blood pressure regulation. I was up in the effector line, in the examples line. Then we could go to the stretch or tendon reflex. This is when you tap on the different tendons and you get, your foot to jerk or your ankle to twitch, so to speak. That is a somatic. So I put S next to that and write, stretch or / tendon reflex in the somatic box here. Pupillary and respiratory rates are both autonomic. So A and A for those. And you can write those into this examples of reflex under autonomic column. Pupillary reflex, respiratory reflex, or respiratory rate. And then the crossed extensor reflex is somatic. So put S next to it and write that into the box for somatic nervous system examples of reflexes. All right, so to go back through here, peristalsis is A, flexor reflex is S. For somatic, heart rate and blood pressure regulation are both A. Stretch and tendon reflexes are S. Pupillary reflex and respiratory rate are A, both. And then the crossed extensor reflex is S. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the top and let's look at some of the images. Again, these are video links that I have up there that I took, a video with my phone, looking and identifying the different structures in the spinal cord models, in the reflex arcs, looking at the cranial nerves. And then we also have, and I think those are pretty helpful. I love your feedback on it. If you use that and you liked it and thought it was helpful to actually see the models like that, let me know. If you didn't like it, you don't have to tell me. It'll hurt my feelings. Yeah. Okay, So here we're looking at, believe it or not, it's a spinal cord model. Now we have the connective tissues to the outside. We can see, these different nerves entering and exiting the anterior and posterior aspect. We can see the spinal cord actually in the middle. This is a very old model. I don't generally use this model, but you can use it to study from. So we're pointing to this outer connective tissue layer here at 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here we have the dura mater, arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space, and pia mater. I don't think I've ever used that model, you guys, honestly, because it's so old. But I use this a lot. This one I like. I like it. And we used this actually in lab 1 when we used, this is an example for the spinal cord, as an organ. Spinal cord, part of the nervous system, found in the vertebral cavity. Right, so we come back to it, I said, in the nervous system, and here we are. All right. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to look at, there's a couple approaches to doing this. We can look at these outer structures, like the fat layer here that one is pointing to, and look, it goes all the way around circumferentially, and that is your epidural space. And then I kind of look at the different meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater, and I kind of identify those things first. And then I look at all the nerve structures, like the nerve roots, like over here, what is that, number 15? I can't hardly even see it, number 15. I look at the dorsal and ventral nerve roots, or the posterior and anterior nerve roots, and then I look at all the nerve stuff, the white matter versus the gray matter. But eventually you just, we'll get to all of it over time. But one is pointing to that fatty layer. So that's the epidural space. And it helps cushion, and secure and insulate the spinal cord. 2 and 1 are pointing to regions of the gray matter here, the spinal cord. All right, we have white matter area, and then we have the gray parts. And it kind of looks like 2 wings of a butterfly connected through the center. So we have a posterior horn, an anterior horn. We actually have lateral horns too, but we generally just have you identify the posterior and anterior, because those are areas where we're going to find different nerve cell bodies associated with reflexes. And then we have what's called a gray commissure. It's kind of this gray bar that connects one butterfly wing to another, and the hole in the center, which is the central canal. All right, so we have the epidural space. We have a lot of adipose connective tissue there, fat, and blood vessels, as you can see. Posterior horn, anterior horn, right? And we have the central canal. That's where we have some cerebrospinal fluid. Right? In the posterior horn, we will find the cell bodies of interneuron or association neurons. And in the anterior horn, it's going to take them, he has the MNCB, but if you don't, you're like, what's the MN? It stands for motor neuron cell bodies. So posterior horn, you can write here, interneuron or association neuron cell bodies. I'm not sure why that's not written here. And in the anterior horn, we're going to find the motor neuron cell bodies. Okay, new same model. We're going to just look at different stuff. Here we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now 2 is pointing to this kind of lump of yellow tissue. That's where the motor neurons, the cell bodies of sensory neurons are going to be located. Sensory neurons, their bodies are clustered together in what's called a ganglion, because that term ganglion means a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And this is outside, really, technically, of the central nervous system. And all those bodies take up space. So it forms kind of a lump here. Their axons continue at number 4, and those sensory nerves entered into the back part, the posterior aspect of the spinal cord, at those posterior gray horns. Right, so sensory comes in and enters in the spinal cord to the posterior aspect, because here you can see, the spinous process of a vertebra. And then from the anterior aspect and the anterior gray horn, which we said is where the motor neuron cell body is going to be located, their axons leave here, as number 3, as the ventral or anterior nerve roots. Okay, so One is pointing to some of the white matter there. We said white matter tracks can either be ascending or descending, and they can be off to anywhere where you have white matter in that spinal cord. Some of those are composed of axons carrying information upstairs to your brain, like an elevator, or there are other regions that are carrying information down in the down elevator from the brain down to a particular vertebral level, so it can go out into those particular motor neurons that, let's say, are the nerves supplied to your quadriceps or to your biceps brachii muscle, something like that. They're dispersed throughout the white matter there. You can't decipher, you can't tell by looking at that, which are the sensory and motor. You just have to know, in neurology, just study where in those particular areas they're located. So anyways, it just represents white matter tracks. Some of those are sensory ascending tracks and some are descending carrying motor commands. 2 is the posterior root ganglion that contains the SNCB, the sensory neuron cell bodies. You have the anterior root, those are the motor neuron axons leaving, and the posterior roots are the sensory neurons entering. This is that slide about the nerves, right, where we can see the 3 different connective tissue layers. So the connective tissue layer that's capable of surrounding this entire group of 3 fascicles, 3 clusters of neurons. The connective tissue to the outer periphery, they can go around the whole bundle of them, is the epineurium. A connective tissue layer that clearly could only go around one fascicle, then that would be the perineurium. And to the interior here, if we can blow this up and see what each axon of nerves looks like, it has its own connective tissue layer surrounding it, just like the motor cell and fibers. The skeletal muscle cells and fibers. You will see an endoneurium. And to the interior that you can often see a little black dot, which will be the axon, and the white non-stating area surrounding that black dot, would be the fat surrounding that one particular, see, this gets better, that one particular fiber. So here they kind of look like, if we could magnify, this is pretty good, right up here at about 3 o'clock. They kind of look like macaronis on end. If we could magnify it a little bit more, you would see this black tissue, that would be the endoneurium. And sometimes in the center, you can see this black dot, that would be the axon. And then the clear fatty stuff surrounding it that doesn't take up stain, that would be the myelin sheath. Okay, so here he's made a little card. The epineurium goes around the entire bundle. The perineurium surrounds one fascicle, and within that surrounding one nerve fiber or axon would be the endoneurium. Okay, this he's kind of integrating. I generally use this later in the special senses, and that's why I did the videos as I did. But we're looking down on an eye muscle, an eye model. And because you don't know what muscles these are, or this is actually number 1 is the tendon of a muscle, it kind of doesn't make sense, but he's telling you right now that by the time you go over these eye models, that number 1 is sitting on, that is the tendon of the superior oblique muscle. So that's going to represent superior oblique. So what cranial nerve would be associated with the superior oblique muscle? That would be the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4. And 2 is sitting on top of what's called the lateral rectus muscle. This is the muscle out toward the ear side, of your eye. And that cranial nerve would be cranial nerve 6, abducens. I think we get a little bit ahead of ourselves doing it this way, but it's okay. It'll all come together. Trochlear and abducens. Here we're on top of what's called superior rectus, and this would be oculomotor, because we said, that trochlear only innervates one muscle. That's the superior oblique, and over to the lateral aspect here below this great big Lacrimal gland is your lateral rectus muscle. That would be trochlear. And so all the other muscles of the eye, which you can somewhat see the red fibers, of course, here, but over here on the medial aspect, there are going to be two more down below here. Those will all be innervated by ocular motor. But I won't ask you that until we do the eye lab, which is the next lab. Okay, here we're looking at a muscular head model. And here we're looking, one is on top of zygomaticus, and one is pointing to the masseter muscle. So it's oh, which cranial nerves? Well, if it's skeletal muscle, this is some kind of movement, so it's a motor component. And zygomaticus helps you smile, so it would be facial expression, right? That would be the facial nerve. But 2 is pointing to masseter, like it could point to temporalis up here. Those are muscles with chewing or mastication. That would be trigeminal. All right, now we're pointing to the skin of the face. So what cranial nerve conveys sensation from the skin of the face or facial sensation? That would be trigeminal. Here we're looking at organs in the over here at the abdominal pelvic cavity. We can see a pancreas, a large intestine, small intestine, or the heart. Whether it's sensory or motor to these organs, it's the same cranial nerve, and it's the only cranial nerve that supplies anything below the shoulders, and that would be vagus nerve. Remember, it has other, functions as well. I could point to, I could use what's called, when we look at the alien tongue model, hopefully there's another picture of that. That would be for speech and swallowing. Remember, I could also use it, the taste bud slide for taste, and we know that 3 cranial nerves provide that sensation or convey that sensation: facial nerve, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. Okay, we're pointing to sternocleidomastoid, but we could also be pointing behind that index card to trapezius. What cranial nerve? That would be accessory nerve. Oh, here's the alien tongue model. Yay. So here we're talking about we're talking about speech. So that would be glossopharyngeal and hypoglossal, glossopharyngeal as well. Okay, here we have the reflex arcs. We have the skin starting here at number 1. And that gray thing represents, I think, is like a nail or something that you're stepping on or in your hand. So this is where our reflex begins, some kind of pain sensation, perhaps, in the skin, like a free nerve ending is being stimulated. Right. Then we have in blue here, we have a sensory neuron, which is the second component of a reflex arc. Then we have the next neuron, that's an association or interneuron. And then we have the motor neuron in red, a multipolar motor neuron, conveying the impulse away from the central nervous system, terminating on the last structure here, which is some red skeletal muscle. That would be the effector. So we have 1, which is your receptor. Then that blue neuron, that's your sensory neuron. Remember that the cell bodies of those sensory neurons are going to be clustered in a ganglion called the posterior root ganglion. And then we have the interneuron or association neuron. That would be the next neuron, in the chain. And then we have, the motor neuron here. It's axon transporting the impulse away to the effector, which is going to be the skeletal muscle in this case. The cell bodies of that motor neuron are found in the anterior gray horn. And previously, when we're looking at the association neuron cell bodies here that 4 is pointing to are found in the posterior gray horn, because that's where that sensory neuron is going to synapse with that association neuron. Okay, so back to this picture. Motor neuron, cell bodies located in the anterior horn. Then you have the rest of the motor neuron, that's its axon. And then the effector is the last structure in this reflex. In this case, it would be skeletal muscle. Now, I like this model also because it shows you where the cell bodies are located. So we start at number 1 at a receptor, and then in yellow, we have a sensory neuron. And here's the cluster of cell bodies. You can see this is a unipolar neuron, so it kind of looks like a hanger. They're all clustered in here in this lumpy area called the dorsal root ganglion. All right, so that's the cell body of a sensory neuron. In yellow, it enters the posterior or dorsal gray horn, and of course, this happens on both sides, right? Or is capable of happening on both sides. It synapses with the green neuron here. That's an association or interneuron. Its cell body is in the posterior gray horn. It carries the impulse to the motor neuron in the anterior or ventral horn. Then the motor neuron carries the impulse away in the orange neuron to the effector in red here. Oh, let me just back up a minute. So the reason why I like this so much is that you can see where each cell body is located. So if you get a question that asks you, where is the cell body of a motor neuron found, or an association neuron, or a sensory neuron, and you haven't maybe gotten to a picture that used this model to remind you where they are, you can always go back a couple of questions. You can change your answers. They're not written in stone. You can go back and revise your answers, but once you hit submit, then, the exam, then there's no going back. But, hey, if you forget where they're located, you have a question like that, and, you didn't get to this model until you got to question like 32, you're like, oh, rats, I wish I knew that. Well, just go back and, rescan those questions to see if there's, you can find the one and confirm, the question as to where, reread the question and go, okay, now I know I just reviewed where the sensory, association, and motor neuron cell bodies are located. Okay, so I don't use the sheet brains, so I'm just gonna kind of zippy through here to, yep, and that was the last one. All right, so the videos I put up there I think are extremely helpful for this. I know it sounds like there's a lot of back and forth, and there is, because a lot of these cranial nerves function in the special senses, and we haven't gotten to the special senses yet, but if I ask you functions about those nerves, it will be answers like for instance, for oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens. If I ask you about the motor component of it, its function, it's going to be right now, it's just eye movement. I don't expect you to know the specific muscles until we do it next week. So don't get too freaked out about it. Again, I'm not watching you taking these quizzes, so, but I would study as much as I can this material, because it takes a little bit for you to, it's like the chemistry chapter. It takes some practice and some real elbow grease to really get down these functions. But I'm telling you is if you really keep working on it now, and then if you come up with a good short version, put it next to your study station, and the next semester in A&P2, and then when you're a micro, keep reviewing these, because when you get into the nursing program, or like in the physical therapy associate, the PTA program, you'll already reviewed a lot of these functions, and mind you, these cranial nerves have other functions as well that are, very kind of complicated, and there's always minutia to these things, but these are the basics, and these are how you use them for doing different reflexes, like the gag reflex, where you put a tongue depressor in the person's mouth, and you stroke the back of the throat, and you get them to gag. It's called the gag reflex for a reason. You're testing the sensory part of this reflex arc, which you just saw. It starts with some kind of receptor on a sensory neuron to the central nervous system, out to a motor neuron, and then that motor neuron is going to stimulate some muscles to contract. Well, it starts with the ability to sense it using glossopharyngeal on the back of the throat. That's why I wanted you to know throat sensation as part of, glossopharyngeal. And it travels through this reflex arc, and then you gag, right? Well, that's due to the motor component of vagus nerve causing the muscles of your throat to contract and, and gag. So that one gag reflex is testing the sensory component of glossopharyngeal, but the motor component of vagus. And that's why I wanted you to know that. Okay, well, that is the end of Lab 11.